my name is Ainoam Quinones, and the presentation that I'm going to give today is on Shel Silverstein. Now, Shel Silverstein is a very famous author and poet, and a very famous person in children's literature. And that is definitely what I'm going to be mentioning, a lot of his books today, but definitely going to be mentioning a lot of details that were probably not as known. As we read his books, we can further understand his point of view in his early life and his early stages. So let's begin. So Shel Silverstein, he was born in his early life, he was born September 25th, 1930, and he was actually born in Chicago, Illinois, so a very big city, but he was born in the 1930s. And that was very surprising because he's such a very well-known author even now in the 2000s, and so he was actually born in 1930s, but he still has so much influence on children's literature today. So he was actually married to a woman called Susan Hastings, but he was not married very long. But in that marriage, he did have a daughter named Shoshana in the 1970s, so he was about 40 when he had her, and he had a very tragic life, some very tragic events that occurred in his life, and I'm assuming a very depressing stage because his daughter, after his daughter was born a few years later, she actually passed away, and she was about 11 years old, because she died in around 1982. So she was about 11 years old, and that was something that was definitely very tragic for Shel Silverstein. Although he was not very close to her, it was still a huge impact on his life. And he did end up having another child, and this was actually a boy named Matthew. And he was definitely way more involved in his life than he was with Shoshana. But Matthew Silverstein here definitely got to enjoy his father's presence in a deeper way because Shel Silverstein was way more involved in his life. And so now that we know a lot of his early life, throughout the 1950s, he actually enlisted in the U.S. Army, and he served in Korea and Japan most of throughout his course of his enlisting in the U.S. Army. And he did work in the Stars and Stripes magazine, which was definitely in the culture of in the Army. He got introduced to this magazine, and he started not actually writing for them, not writing poetry, but definitely having cartoons and illustrations. So he would submit those and work for this Stars and Stripes magazine. So as you can tell, this is one of the covers. Now this is a more modern one, but he's from the 1900s, so he definitely it was an older version, but he did have a lot of cartoons, and he was very involved in this magazine. So after he did his time in the Army and he got out, he actually started illustrating cartoons for other magazines. He actually was in the Looks magazine, which is, I have the cover right here, this red one with the two girls on them, and he did do cartoons for them. And also one of the more famous ones that is very prominent today is the Sports Illustrated, which is obviously about sports, but he did have a lot of influence there with his cartoons, and he did work for them for some time. So that is very interesting because we wouldn't think of him as to have work in these different types of magazines. The Looks magazine, which is more about fashion, and Sports Illustrated, which is about sports, which has nothing to do with what he's famous for now, which is children's literature. So that is a very different thing. But a lot of his background was about music, so he did have a lot of influence with music, and but he was not recognized a lot for that. So a lot of different things that happened in his life that he was not famous for, but definitely, as we're gonna see later on, it did influence his literature, and it is important so we can see his background and see how he thinks, where he came from, and that definitely influences what he writes later on. So he continued to publish cartoons, and the first illustration that he came out with, and the first thing that he published was this Take 10 book in 1955. And so there's not as much color there. You can see black and white and a little bit of red. But this Grab Your Socks in 1956 definitely has a lot more color in that yellow and red you can see there. And what we can see throughout Shel Silverstein in his publication history is that he has a sense of urgency. He publishes things in a very quick manner that it's amazing. You know, these two books are just a year apart, and so that is definitely impressing. And this third book called Now Here's a Plan. Here's My Plan, a book of utilities, and this is in the 1960s, so 4 years after the Grab My Socks book, but still very impressive in how much time he had it out. And this book with a great cover is a cover that he's really recognized for, and is a very important part of his career and building up his career. So he is very well known for this cover specifically in his early stages of his writing career. In 1964, he came out with two very famous books that we know today, The Giraffe and a Half, and this one has a little bit less color, but definitely some there, and The Giving Tree, which is a book that I have right here, which I'm going to read towards the end of the presentation, but definitely a lot more color. This one is mostly green, and still, you know, two books published in the same year. I think that is very impressive. Even though it's not, you know, a huge novel, still it takes time for illustrations and for making poetry. And even him, he did not have any education or any experience. Well, he did have experience, but no education in writing or anything like that. He didn't have a degree in this, so I think that is very, very impressive. And even in his drawings and his cartoons that we know him for now today, he did not have any education whatsoever in that, professional education, but he definitely did have a lot of experience and with the books that he has published. So in the 1970s, he came out with a lot of books throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, and there's definitely a similarity in these books, and I'm going to see if you can see what they are, but they're definitely they stand out in the covers that he has. So Where the Sidewalk Ends, this was in 1974, and this is more about childhood. Well, a lot of his books are about childhood, but this one is mostly about childhood and embracing the childhood and kind of enjoying the life of not being an adult and not having as much responsibility, which can be a mixed debate about is that a good example for children, because we want children to mature, and if we're wanting them to enjoy their childhood and not grow up, then are we helping them? It's a gray area, and definitely how we should raise our children and what we want to teach them. But definitely a very, very famous book. The Missing Piece in 1976, so just 2 years after. This one is more about just kind of the missing piece as a child. You know, we are constantly looking something to fill it up, and obviously this is a very general, broad theme, because a lot of his poems are very different and each have their own theme, but that's why it has the Missing Piece title there. A Light in the Attic, as you can see, has a little house on the child's head, and that is definitely about embracing the child's imagination. And all of these books are mostly about childhood, which can be seen because there obviously is a children's book all throughout. But as you can see, this one, The Missing Piece, the big O, is following up with The Missing Piece, so it's like a part 2 of it. And there, as you can see, all of these different illustrations of the covers of the book, you can tell the similarities of all of these covers, and how we can tell that is definitely Shel Silverstein in his style. there. And the falling up, also you can definitely tell throughout the hair and the shading there that is definitely Shel Silverstein, and drawing a skinny elephant in 1998. So if you didn't already notice, the similarities between all these books is that they're all black and white, and there's no explanation, as much research into why he backed away from the color for a bit, but definitely you can see a similarity in a pattern that there was no color used, just black and white. But even then, he managed to sell so many books and become a very famous author and poet as we know him today. So a very classic look, but something that was very prominent in his career in the 1970s and the 1980s. So he unfortunately did die. He was born in the 1930s, so he did die in May 10, 1999, so just before 2000s. And so that was definitely very tragic. He was living in Key West at the moment when he died, and so definitely a ways from Chicago, but that was where his family lived for a little bit, and that's where he got to pass away. But there were a lot of different things that we can see as looking back from Shel Silverstein's career. He did sell more than 20 million copies of his books, and that is a huge number, despite the fact that, he did not have any education whatsoever in his illustrations and his writing. I think that is amazing that he did not have any education, and he still managed to be a bestseller and sell all of these famous books that we even know today in 2020. And I'm sure for years to come, we'll definitely be reading his books and his poetry. And he did have them in more than 30 languages translated. That is definitely a huge number, and got to reach probably why he has so many millions of copies of his book is because it's very wide and known to a lot of languages and a lot of cultures. So we can definitely tell there that he was very famous, and throughout different cultures and languages, people wanted to read his books, and it was definitely very famous throughout, not only here in the United States where he mostly published. So I'm going to now read from The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein, which I showed earlier. So this book is The Living Tree by Shel Silverstein. He is actually the illustrator of this as well. So, yeah. Shel Silverstein, The Giving Tree, for Nikki. Once there was a tree, and she loved a little boy. And every day the boy would come, and he would gather her leaves and make them into crowns and play king of the forest. He would climb up her trunk and swing from her branches and eat apples. I want an apple. And they would play hide and go seek. And when he was tired, he would sleep in her shade. And the boy loved the tree very much. And the tree was very happy. But time went by. And the boy grew older, and the tree was often alone. Aww. Then one day, the boy came to the tree, and the tree said, "Come, boy, come and climb up my trunk and swing from my branches and eat apples and play in my shade and be happy." "I am too big to climb and play," said the boy. "I want to buy things and have fun. I want some money. Can you give me some money?" "I'm sorry," said the tree, "but I have no money. I have only leaves and apples. Take my apples, boy. Sell them in the city. Then you will have money and you will be happy." So the boy climbed up the tree and gathered her apples and carried them away. And the tree was happy. But the boy stayed away for a long time, and the tree was very sad. And the tree shook with joy, and she said, "Come, boy, climb on my trunk and swing my branches and be happy." So that is just a short little bit of The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein. So we can definitely see a lot about his culture and the way that he would write and his poems. Obviously, this is not a poem book, but definitely a very famous book. And we can definitely see a lot of his illustrations there and how they flow so well together with the story and give us a context of the story. And definitely a beautiful style, which Shel Silverstein was definitely known for. So it is amazing to be able to learn about these authors and definitely read more about them to kids and children in schools. So thank you.